Hey there, welcome back to another video just like last time. My name is Nick. Got my notes right here like always, and today we're talking about a bit of disaster season. This is the 1974-75 expansion year. That brought two teams into the NHL, and those two teams were the Washington Capitals and the Kansas City Scouts. If you're not familiar with the Kansas City Scouts, they would join as the Scouts and then relocate to Colorado and become the Colorado Rockies. That's correct. And then they would relocate once again, this time to New Jersey, and become the New Jersey Devils. So that might be why you've never heard of them. It's okay. Just sit back. We'll enjoy this ride together. So these two teams ready to take the ice, and they tap their two head coaches. Washington goes with Jim Anderson, while Kansas City Scouts choose Bep Widlon to lead them. Both teams would make their NHL debuts on October 9th, 1974. The Capitals would face the New York Rangers, who they would lose to by a score of 6-3, while the Kansas City Scouts would face off against the Toronto Maple Leafs, losing 6-2. I will be putting the logos up as I talk so that we can keep track of whose bad season we are talking about. In the Capitals' third game of the season, they would get their first non-loss by tying, the Los Angeles Kings 1-1. Back in those days, there was no shootout. If it was tied at the end of overtime, it ended as a tie. They would follow up that tie by getting their first NHL win in their fourth game of the season, beating the Chicago Blackhawks by a score of 4-3. That would be the only time this entire 80-game season that they would have two back-to-back games that were not losses for the Capitals. Only time in 80 games. Kansas City Scouts would get their first non-loss in their sixth game of the season when they tied the California Golden Seals by a score of 4-4. They would go on to get their first NHL win in the 10th game of their season, beating their expansion brothers, the Washington Capitals, by a score of 5-4. After 10 games, the two teams had identical records at 1 win, 8 losses, and 1 tie. After getting their first win in their fourth game of the season, the Capitals would go on a 10-game losing streak, which hit its low point on November 10th, 1974, when they would play the Montreal Canadiens and lose by a score of 11-1. 10-goal differential in one game is absolutely ridiculous. They would finally snap that skid by tying the Flames by a score of 2-2 in game 15 of their season. And then they would go on to get their second win of the season, beating the California Golden Seals 6-4 in game 19. For Kansas City, in game 14 and 15 of their season, they would get their first set of back-to-back wins, beating the St. Louis Blues 5-3 and following that up by beating the New York Islanders by a score of 4-2. In their 20th game of the season, they would once again put a notch in that win column by beating the Vancouver Canucks by a score of 4-3. At the end of the 20-game stretch into the season, the Capitals would have a record of 2 wins, 16 losses, and 2 ties, while the Kansas City Scouts would have 4 wins, 15 losses, and 1 tie. Not too bad for Kansas City having double the amount of wins of the Capitals 20 games in. The next 10-game stretch was not a good one for the Capitals. In game 21 of their season, they would get another tie, this time against the Minnesota North Stars, 4-4, but then they would go on to lose their next 7 games before tying the New York Rangers in game 29 of their season 6-6. The Kansas City Scouts would go on a 7-game winless streak of their own. Game 23 for them was the low point when they had their own 10-goal differential game in favor of the Philadelphia Flyers. The Flyers won that game 10-0. So it's really up to you, like glass half full, half empty, comparing those two 10-goal differential games, because the Scouts didn't score at all and gave up 10 goals, but the Capitals gave up 11 and scored 1. So which one's worse? Well, I guess they're both the same because it's a 10-goal differential. Just like glass half full, half empty, I guess. They would go on to get another win in game 28 of their season by beating the California Golden Seals. After 30 games, the Washington Capitals had a record of 2 wins, 24 losses, and 4 ties, while the Kansas City Scouts had a record of 5 wins, 22 losses, and 3 ties. Game 31 for the Capitals brought them just their third win of the season when they beat the Toronto Maple Leafs by a score of 3-1. meaning the Maple Leafs became the first team to lose to both of these terrible expansion teams. They would then, after beating the Maple Leafs, would go on to lose the next 9 games. The Scouts would fare a bit better in their next 10-game stretch. They would start off 0 wins, 5 losses, and 1 tie, but would finish out this stretch winning 3 of their last 4 in this 10 games, beating the Detroit Red Wings 2-1, then the Minnesota North Stars 5-2, then the Washington Capitals again by a score of 5-3. We're through 40 games at this point. This is the halfway mark of this season. There was only 80 games. The Capitals have a record of 3 wins, 33 losses, and 4 ties, while the Kansas City Scouts have a record of 8 wins, 28 losses, and 4 ties. 2 of those 8 wins, though, are against a 3-win team. Keep that in mind. The Caps were still struggling, but they would tie the Boston Bruins in the 41st game of their season by a score of 3-3. Then they would go on another losing streak, this one being 7 games. They would snap that streak by beating the Detroit Red Wings by a score of 6-3. Kansas City were learning not to lose, but they weren't necessarily winning. They would beat the Chicago Blackhawks in game 43 by a score of 4-1, and then they would beat the Bruins by a score of 3-2 in game 45. And then they would get back-to-back ties in games 47 and 48, tying the Bruins and the Flames 3-3 and 4-4 respectively. Through 50 games in the season, the Capitals had a record of 4 wins, 41 losses, and 5 ties. The Kansas City Scouts had 10 wins, 32 losses, and 6 ties. For the Capitals, from game 50 to 54 of their season, it was another 5-game losing streak. After a 7-3 loss to the Rangers, the Capitals decided it was time for a change. So just 54 games into their young history as an NHL franchise, they decided to fire Jim Anderson as their head coach and replace him with Red Sullivan. In those 54 games where they were captained by not captained, but coached by Jim Anderson, the Capitals went 4 wins, 45 losses, and 5 ties. The Capitals would get a new coaching bump, winning Sullivan's first game behind the bench, getting their revenge on the Rangers by a score of 7-4. On their 58th game of the season, Sullivan would get his second win, beating the Kansas City Scouts. And this was the only time out of 4 meetings this season that the Capitals would beat the Scouts. This one by a score of 3-0. Kansas City was getting wins a bit more regularly than Washington would be. They won Game 52, beating the Toronto Maple Leafs 3-2. Game 54, beating the California Golden Seals again by a score of 2-1. And then win Game 56, beating the Washington Capitals for a 3rd time this season by a score of 5-1. Through 60 games, the Washington Capitals had a record of 6-48-5, while the Kansas City Scouts had a record of 13-38-8. For the Capitals, after beating their expansion brothers, the Kansas City Scouts, they would go on a 17-game losing streak. The worst game of that run being a 12-1 loss to the Penguins in game 70 of their season. So 12-1, that's an 11 goal differential game for them. That's even worse than their 10 goal differential game. For the Kansas City Scouts, they would go on to beat the Minnesota North Stars by a score of 4-2 in game 61, but would also find themselves on their own 16-game winless streak. The Scouts would have 3 games that they tied. Through 70 games, the Washington Capitals had a record of 6 wins, 59 losses, and 5 ties, while Kansas City was sitting with 14 wins, 46 losses, and 10 ties. In the midst of a historical losing streak, the Capitals decided it was time to part ways with their second head coach of the season, relieving Red Sullivan of his duties after only 18 games. The Caps had a record of 2-16 under Red Sullivan. general manager Milt Schmidt decided he would take over as head coach for the remainder of the season. After Schmidt took over, the Capitals would win two more games before the end of the season, beating the California Golden Seals 5-3 in Game 76 and finishing out their season with a win over the Pittsburgh Penguins, getting revenge for that 12-1 game, beating them by a score of 8-4 in Game 80 to finish out their season. The Scouts would snap their winless streak by beating the Los Angeles Kings 3-1, and that would be the final win of their season. The final records for these teams: Capitals had 8 wins, 67 losses, and 5 ties, while the Kansas City Scouts had 15 wins, 54 losses, and 11 ties. Now, here are just some stats from these two teams for these seasons. The Washington Capitals had 181 goals for, but gave up 446 goals. Their stats leader was Tom Williams. He had 22 goals, 36 assists, and 58 points. Kansas City had 184 goals for and gave up 328. So they gave up over 100 less goals than the Capitals did, but they only scored 3 more goals the entire season. Their stat leader was Simon Nolet. He had 26 goals, 32 assists for 58 points. His 26 goals was tied with Wilf Pateman. I believe that's how you say that name. And now looking at these goalie stats, Kansas City has some pretty decent goalie stats. Washington, on the other hand, Ron Lowe is their main goalie with the most stats. He played 48 games. He had a record of 8 wins, 36 losses, and 2 ties, and a goals against average of 5.45. Michael Ballmer played 35 games, had 0 wins, 24 losses, and 3 ties, and a goals against average of 5.36. And then John Adams, not President John Adams, goalie John Adams, played 8 games, had a record of 0 wins, 7 losses, and 0 ties, and a goals against average of 6.90. Looking at Kansas City's goalies, they had Peter McDuff, or McDuffie. I think it's McDuff, though, because it's an E. He played 36 games, had a record of 7 wins, 25 losses, and 4 ties, with a 4.23 goals against average. He was followed by Dennis Herron, who had 22 games played, a record of 4 wins, 13 losses, and 4 ties, with a 3.75 goals against average. And then Michel Place had 24 games played, 4 goals, I'm talking about a goalie, 4 wins, 16 losses, and 3 ties, with a 4.06 goals against average. And the last stat I will leave you with is Bill Mickelson was a negative 82, minus 82 on the season for the Capitals, which is still the worst plus minus in a season for an NHL player. So there you go. This is the disastrous 1974 expansion. It was originally only going to be about the Capitals. And then I saw how bad the Scouts did in their inaugural season too, and I was like, let's just lump the two teams together. But if you made it this far, you might as well hit that subscribe button. You know, if you do that, that's going to help me fund my hat addiction. Get your favorite team's hat on my head the next time I do a video on them. But until then, bye bye.